This is Confounders for V574 Epidemiology and Biostatistics. Age-related maculopathy or age-related macular degeneration can happen at any age, but the incidence is low until you're at older ages. AMD can lead to the complete loss of macular vision, making it difficult to read, recognize faces or expressions, or use a computer or watch TV. Some lifestyle choices may affect the risk for AMD. As an example, optometrists warn smokers that they're at increased risk of AMD if they smoke. Strong evidence of this has been produced by case control studies. Smoking is a risk factor for AMD. 435 cases with end-stage AMD. That means choroidal neovascularization and geographic atrophy. That means complete death, essentially, of the retina in those locations. And 280 controls. That created an odds ratio of 2.64 for subjects who smoke greater than 40 packs a year. One way to think of that is you have a risk of about 2.5 times normal if you smoke greater than 40 packs per year, is another way to interpret an odds ratio. Odds ratios are also the same thing as relative risks. Case control studies, cases are people with the problem. In this case, the end-stage AMD. Controls are people without the problem who are matched on factors such as age, sex, and socioeconomic status. Exposure is the factor under study. In this case, we're talking about smoking. You want to ask whether exposure is more common in that case than in the controls. During a case control study, it's important to have matching. Cases and controls selected independently of exposure, involving the selected comparison of subjects so that the potential problem factors are identical. That means that's why you need to match age, gender, other exposure things like social and economic statuses, either by individual or category matching. Multiple matches can be used for each case in order to reduce the variance, usually in a ratio of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. You don't want to go higher than that because you lose your matching. Our ultimate measured effect is odds ratios or relative risk, which is the equivalent. The odds of exposure among persons with disease divided by the odds of exposure with persons without that disease. Odds. The odds ratio of exposed to numbers not exposed. In this example, the cases had 53 people who developed AMD out of 382. That leaves you an incidence of 0.14 for people who smoked greater than 40 packs per year. The controls, conversely, only had 14 patients out of 266. So you have an incidence of 0.05 on AMD if you didn't smoke 40 packs or more a year. So we then divide the 0.14 by 0.05 to get 2.64. That's how you calculate an odds ratio or relative risk. The interpretation of an odds ratio, a risk of 1 means that there's really no change between the risk and the control condition. A risk greater than 1 means that there's an increased risk, which is why in our AMD example for smoking, the odds was 2.64, which means it's 2.64 times more likely to develop AMD if you smoke greater than 40 packs. A risk factor for less than 1 is a decreased risk factor or protective factor. One example of that in AMD is exercise has been shown to be protective to developing AMD. Other examples could be taking vitamins like lutein has been shown to be successful at reducing your risk for developing end-stage AMD. Well, what about drinking beer causing AMD? In this study from the Beaver Dam study, in men who drank 78 grams more per week of alcohol from beer, the 5-year age-adjusted incidence of soft incident drusen was 13%, compared to 5.8% in men who did not drink beer at baseline. Beer also was associated with incidence of increased confluence of soft drusen and the development of larger areas of drusen only in men. But wine is protective from AMD. There was a significant inverse relationship between wine consumption and the incidence of increased drusen. 18.4% of the subjects not consuming wine, 15.3% in those that consumed less than 23 grams, and 13.2% in those that consumed greater than 23 grams. So there's a slight protective effect by red wine, but not by beer. That would raise some questions of why that is. So does beer drinking really cause AMD? If a relationship observed herein can confirm that it is beer if consumption is associated with early signs of AMD, whereas liquor is not associated, and wine shows a slight protective effect, then this would argue that it's not the alcohol itself, but some other factor associated with the beer that's at risk. An argument can be made for the toxic effects of things like nitrosamines or other substances in beer that are linked to ARM. However, no other reports regarding such association have been found. Alternatively, consumption of beer may be an indicator for other lifestyle or dietary factors. These were the findings from the Beaver Dam study looking at beer consumption. And here's some other comments from them. Perhaps that people who drink beer have a lower intake of carotenoids or other vegetables. Perhaps there's incidents of early signs of AMD that weren't caught. This is an example of something called a confounder. A confounder is another risk factor for a study that they had not considered which is associated with the factors being studied. In this case, lifestyle and dietary factors affect development of AMD, and beer drinking may also be associated with these factors. Here's an example for age. Here's our cases, our controls, and the development of AMD. There's an increased odds ratio in this situation. If we don't match for age, in this case, there's really no difference between the two groups. A confounder cannot be caused by the factor or exposure under study, or else it would be an intermediate or intervening variable between the factor and the disease. Confounding is specific to a particular study. The same variable which confounds an association in one study may not confound in a similar association in some other studies. Thank you. The end.